For whatever reason, whenever the conversation shifts to a Sonic fighting game, people only ever talk about Sonic the Fighters, which I guess makes sense because that was an arcade game, so it probably had a lot more attention on it and a lot more people played it than a Game Boy Advance game did. But Sonic Battle really does deserve to be in that conversation a lot more, perhaps even more so than Sonic the Fighters, because you could argue that this is probably a better fighting game. I mean, Sonic the Fighters has a pretty universally negative reception to it, whereas Sonic Battle, while it doesn't have much of a reception at all, generally when I hear people talk about Sonic Battle, is relatively positive for the most part, kind of. But I guess that's kind of just the nature of being a spin-off game on a handheld that no one cares about. But I care about it, and so I want to do a video talking about Sonic Battle, and so here we are. And as it turns out, I actually am a fighting game fan, and so I'm hoping that with this video I'll be able to dive into the game a little bit deeper than what you normally see when people discuss it and how it works and stuff. So to begin, Sonic Battle is of course a fighting game, but it's a pretty unique fighting game, which is generally pretty rare for the fighting game genre overall. It's a genre of very little innovation, especially back at this time when there weren't like indie games trying to do new things with fighting games. At this point in time, there were pretty much like three types of fighting games. You had your traditional fighting games, you had your arena fighters with things like Power Stone, and then of course you had Smash Brothers, and that was pretty much it. You didn't often see fighting games that tried to do different things. But then here comes Sonic Battle, and it has a fighting system that doesn't really fit into any of those categories exactly. You could say it's kind of like an arena fighter, but to me it actually ends up playing a little bit more like a competitive beat-em-up in a way. So as you can tell, Sonic Battle actually takes place in 3D arenas, which just that alone is pretty impressive for the Game Boy Advance. It is extremely rare you see 3D at all on this system, but while the arenas are 3D, the characters are just 2D sprites, and so that has a lot of implications for how the combat systems of the game end up working, because your characters can only face left or right, and so you have to line yourself up with your opponent for you two to be able to attack each other, though there are actually a couple of attacks in this game that you can manually aim up or down, which is pretty interesting for a fighting system that generally functions on trying to line yourself up with the same plane as your opponent. Anyway, as far as moveset goes in this game, you have a basic 3-hit string that you can do, and then continuing that will get you an ender that kind of functions like a smash attack in Super Smash Bros., where you'll launch your opponent very far away. And you can also do this smash attack just raw at any time. And additionally, this is one of the moves that you can aim what direction you're going to launch your opponent, either away from you or up or down. And that's important because the terrain of the battlefield actually does play a part in what you can do with the combat. Because when you launch your opponent away, if they hit a wall, then they will bounce off that wall, and after launching your opponent away, if you press in the direction you launched them, then your character will automatically, do this special scripted jump where they'll chase after the opponent, and if they bash into a wall, then you can do, a spike move that will launch them into the ground. For fighting game players out there, this is actually kind of very similar to how Dust works in the Guilty Gear games, which is pretty interesting. But anyway, so it becomes very beneficial to launch your opponents into walls, because when they smack into the wall, that does extra damage to them, and then you can land the spike afterwards that does even further additional damage. And this whole system is just kind of a really fun, very kinetic form of fighting that is entirely unique to Sonic Battle. I can't really think of many other fighting games out there where a core element of its design is trying to smack your opponent into walls in order to ping-pong them back and forth with yourself to land extra hits. It's pretty cool. But another thing about it that makes it pretty cool is that if you're the one that was getting launched away, if you press in the direction that you were launched from and you collide with a wall, you won't just bounce off of it and take a bunch of damage. Your character will actually do their own chasing-style scripted jump, and you'll kind of meet the opponent at that point in the air, and then it becomes a race to who's gonna do their spike first, which I think is really cool. It means that if you're the one that's getting smacked around, you can actually turn the tides and take advantage of the fight. As far as other moves go, you can jump, and then you have jumping attacks, and every character also has a unique air action that they can do, while jumping to give them some extra mobility. For example, Sonic can air dash, Tails can fly, Knuckles can glide, and so on and so forth. Naturally, as a fighting game, you would assume that every character has their own moveset that allows them to play differently from each other. You also have a dash you can do if you double tap in any direction, and with that, every character has their own dash attack that they can do specifically when dashing. And then, of course, you have your special moves. You have a ground special move and an air special move. But what's pretty cool about this game is that every character actually has 6 special moves that they can do. Anytime that you're respawning, you can select between 3 different types of special moves. First, you'll pick your grounded special move, then your air special move, and the special move that you do not pick will become your immunity, where you cannot be hit by that specific type of special move if an opponent tries to do it. You have projectile-based special moves, you have physical attack special moves, and then you have trap special moves, where a character will put down some kind of explosive that the enemy can trigger if they step into it. So this gives you a little bit of variability and customizability in terms of how you like to play your character based on what special moves you like to use. Maybe you like to use the melee special on the ground and the projectile special in the air, and so on and so forth. So every character gets to play a little bit differently depending on player preference, which is cool. And then lastly, all there is left is the defensive mechanics in the game, which there is barely anything of. There is just blocking in this game, but blocking in Sonic Battle doesn't work like traditional fighting games where you can hold the block button and continuously block. Instead, it's kind of more like a parry, where you tap it and your character puts up this shield for a second that will block attacks while the shield is up. And interestingly, Sonic Battle doesn't have any kind of throw equivalent. Every single attack in the game can be simply blocked. But the way to get around this is to simply wait for your opponent's block to end, because they're actually pretty vulnerable once their shield goes down. So while there isn't necessarily a way to get around your opponent blocking, if you just wait a little bit for your opponent to block nothing, then you can punish them for that. And the last thing you can do in the game is, after blocking, if you continue to hold down the button, then your character will start to recover, and you can see the meters in the top left corner, their health, and then that green meter above their health. This is kind of the equivalent of Sonic Battle's Super Meter, but it works pretty differently than other fighting games. The way this meter works is that it will fill as you take damage or block attacks, or you can manually fill it by doing the recovery, and different characters have different rates of how quickly they can fill both their health and their super meter. Generally, the recovery thing is something that you're really only going to be able to do after you've killed your opponent and you're waiting for them to respawn, which I actually think is a pretty smart system, by the way, because it means that if you're dead, then you don't want to take too much time thinking about what special moves you want to equip, because if you take too long, then you're giving your opponent an opportunity to heal and build up super meter. But anyway, once you fill the super meter, then your character starts to flash like this, and what this does is the next special move that you do, it will automatically kill everyone it touches in one hit. So obviously that is very powerful, and if you see opponents starting to flash like that, then you gotta be careful. Though it's not a completely infallible thing, because you can still just block the special moves, and also remember that you can make yourself immune to one of the special moves that your opponent might have equipped, and so if they hit you with that, then you're automatically going to block it. And with that, that's pretty much everything in terms of mechanics and how Sonic Battle works. But I don't want to just stop there, because I actually want to talk about what this game is like to actually play it competitively. Now, I haven't actually played Sonic Battle against another person before, so I can't exactly say how it's going to play out, but there are a couple of things that I can definitely see the potential of how this game would play when actually played against real human beings. The first thing I think is that movement and positioning would be very, very important in this game, as it's very important in beat-em-ups. Games that have this style of combat system, where it's a 3D plane, but you can only really fight two-dimensionally by lining up with your opponent. Because of that, it can become very easy to avoid your opponent's attacks simply by just taking a step up and then taking a step back down in order to counterattack while they're in recovery. Related to that, I think the mind game around baiting your opponent to block would become super duper critical. Because blocking is your only defensive option in this game, it's something that players are going to have to rely on quite a bit, but blocking can also be very risky. The nice thing about blocking in this game, because it functions more like a parry, is that the very moment that you block your opponent's attack, you can cancel the recovery of the block into anything you want, and so if you successfully block your opponent's attack, you can basically do whatever you want to them, and there's nothing they can do about it, which is incredibly powerful. but at the same time, all your opponent has to do is walk up to you like they're going to attack and then do nothing, and then if they bait you into successfully attacking, you just left yourself wide open to take whatever they want to do to you. And so I feel like blocking would be actually the more rare way that you would want to defend yourself. You would probably want to primarily rely on simply moving and avoiding your opponent's attacks, and only relying on blocking when you had to, and at the same time when you are blocking, being very careful to ensure that you're not being baited into screwing yourself. And this opens up a lot of potential for mind games, where if your opponent is going to try to do a fake out and get you to block nothing, if you can see that coming, you can just attack them and they'll be standing there doing nothing, waiting for you to block. Also, the whole game of launching your opponent and trying to get those spikes on them become pretty interesting when you think about the fact that you can launch your opponent in different directions. One, it makes the positioning of your fighting very important, because if you can't hit your opponent into a wall, you can still try to spike them by holding onto your spike a little bit longer to let your character fall in the air, but then your opponent isn't actually entirely vulnerable there, and they might actually be able to retaliate. And so I would think that optimally you would want to try to smack your opponent into walls for that extra damage and that guaranteed spike. But the direction that you launch your opponent would also be very important, because they have the opportunity to jump off the wall and attack you back. So ideally what you would want to do is mix your opponent up by launching them in areas where there are multiple walls that they could hit. For example, if the only wall that your opponent could hit right now is the far right wall, then chances are you're probably going to want to launch them to the right so they can hit that wall, which makes it basically a free guess for the opponent that you're going to launch them that way, making it very easy for them to bounce off the wall and to attack you back. Now, of course, you could take the risk with this and just hope that you'll be able to spike them first, but the better thing to do is to just eliminate that risk entirely by having your opponent not be able to successfully jump back off the wall. The way you do that is by making it so they don't know which direction they're going to get launched. So for example, if you now have your opponent close to the corner, you can now launch them into the right wall or the top wall, and so now it becomes a 50-50 guess on your opponent's part. You get launched pretty quickly, and so you don't really have time to react to the direction you're flying in unless you fly really far before you hit into the wall. But if you're relatively close to those walls, then you're just gonna have to make a guess. And so depending on your positioning, that goes from a one-wall guess to a 50-50 two-wall guess to even potentially 3 different directions you can launch your opponent into, making it very difficult for them to correctly guess the direction you're trying to launch them in. And these kinds of things are like classic fighting game mind games that I think are pretty cool. Trying to mix up the way you attack your opponent so they don't know what you're going to do and don't know how to retaliate, while at the same time, while you're being attacked, you're trying to predict what your opponent is going to do and how they're going to mix it up so that way you can fight back when they're trying to launch you around. These are pretty interesting and unique systems that I think are pretty cool and have some serious potential. And I especially think that the special move system in this game is very interesting because of that immunity you get to whatever special move type you don't use. Because at the surface level, this kind of just means that you can tailor your moveset to whatever you like the most. But at a higher level, you can really start to use this to take advantage of your opponent and how they like to play. So, for example, we'll say that your opponent really likes the grounded projectile attack on their character. Well, all you have to do is set the projectile special as your immunity, and now that move that they like to use becomes entirely worthless to them. This can force your opponent to use a special move that's not really as good, just because they don't really have an option to otherwise. But even that is really only scratching the surface of the potential of the special move system in this game, because at the start of a fight, you don't know what special moves your opponent has chosen and which one they've chosen to become immune to. What this means is that anytime you throw out a special move at the beginning of a fight, you're taking a risk there because you don't even know if that's going to work, because if you do the special move and it automatically gets blocked, then your opponent is going to be able to punish you for that. And so using your special moves in and of itself becomes a mind game that you have to do. What special moves do you think your opponent picked? Well, they like this special move, it's their best special move available, but they might have predicted that I selected that immunity, so maybe they didn't use that special move, so maybe they are actually immune to the special move I've selected instead. What did they try to prioritize here, just having the special moves that they want to use, or blocking me from using the special moves I want to use? Perhaps they intentionally picked special moves that they normally don't use, just to make it difficult to guess what they're using, so I don't really know what's safe to use right now. Even just throwing out a special move has a mind game to it that you don't see in any other fighting game that's pretty interesting. And this mind game develops further over the course of the match, because once you kill your opponent, they get to respawn and they get to select new special moves. Meanwhile, you have already fought them and you still have the same moveset that you did previously, meaning they might know what some of your special move selections are, and now they can tailor their new respawning moveset to counter your moveset. If you just took really good advantage of your air melee special attack, then they might specifically select the melee special attack to become their immunity, so you can't use it anymore for the rest of this life. And then that could potentially add another layer to the play where you might actually hold off on using your special moves, so that way your opponent doesn't know what special moves you have equipped. So say, for example, you particularly like to use the air trap special on your character, and your opponent knows that. And while they're fighting you, they try to use their projectile special on you and you automatically block it. They now know that you've selected that special move as your immunity. So they know that you've gone with your melee special and your trap special as your two selections, but they don't know which one is the ground special and which one is the air special, and depending on the character, those ground and air specials can be very different depending on what you've chosen. One could be really, really good, while the other not so much. But while you're fighting your opponent, you don't use either of your special moves, and so now they're respawning and they're thinking, what would be a good moveset to counter my opponent's moveset? I know what they're immune to, but I don't know what special moves they're currently using, and so I don't know what their better option is that would be better for me to make myself immune to. And so they have to take a guess at what your moveset currently is. And that could potentially give you an advantage in the following fight, because now you can start to use your good special move, and maybe they didn't set up their moveset to counter that effectively. And similarly, this sort of deception and trickery can continue as the fight progresses, and it can take multiple different forms. Like, for example, if your opponent never hits you with your immunity special move, then they might not necessarily know what your immunity is, which could potentially give you free reign to use one of your two special moves. You could potentially use your grounded special move, and they won't know what your aerial special move is. They won't know what type you're using and what type you're immune to. So if you kill them and then they respawn, they know your ground special move and they can counter that. But then if they do try to do that, then you can just start using your air special move, which is really, really good, and they weren't prepared for it. And so on and so forth. This attempt to read your opponent's intentions and what they're trying to do and how they're trying to deceive and trick you, there is a lot of potential here for very deep mind games that can go in many different ways. And this especially becomes important when you incorporate the super meter into your considerations. Because if you have full super meter and you don't know what your opponent's immunity is, you might just waste it on your opponent throwing out a special move that they get to block automatically. And a particularly cool thing about blocking the one-shot special move is that if you successfully block it, whether you do it manually with timing or automatically due to your special selection, you automatically get a full super meter of your own to throw back at your opponent. Because of that, it becomes extremely dangerous to just willy-nilly throw out super moves when you have one-shot kill potential. And so paying attention to your opponent's moveset and their selections becomes very important, and thus hiding your selections from your opponent becomes even more important. Like, what the fuck? This is actually an insanely cool system. How the fuck did Sonic Team make this? They're not a fighting game developer. What the hell's going on? Again, this is all just speculative from someone that plays a lot of fighting games, trying to theorize how this game would be played if you played it against other people at a high level. I don't actually know exactly if this is how it would work out, but I see this kind of potential here, and it makes me think that Sonic Battle might actually be a really cool game. Potentially. The problem is, unfortunately, that Sonic Battle definitely does have some significant balance problems and some stuff that could really break the game and lead into some very degenerate play if you're actually trying to play at high level and kill your opponent as effectively and efficiently as possible. And these kinds of issues are not really very surprising to me because, as I just said, Sonic Team is not a fighting game developer. And usually when non-fighting game developers take their hand at fighting games, there's oftentimes problems like this and oversights that they just didn't really understand how these systems would work in such a way where, oh, this becomes a major problem and it could totally break the game. Because Sonic Battle has quite a number of infinites that you can do in the game pretty damn easily. First one I would like to point out is not necessarily an infinite, but I would argue this is still potentially a problem, which is that after you launch your opponent and you spike them into the ground, while they're bouncing up off the ground, they are totally helpless. There is nothing they can do in this state, and you can still hit them while they're like this, so nothing stops you from just launching your opponent again into another wall and spiking them again, and you can just loop this perpetually. Now, of course, your opponent does have the ability to bounce back off the wall and fight back at you, so it's not necessarily an infinite, but you can definitely steamroll your opponent if you can get 2 or 3 spikes on them in a row, if you can successfully get them to not be able to guess which direction you're going to launch them into, which is kind of a problem, I would argue. That's a bit too powerful. There should probably be some sort of spike decay if you continue it in a singular combo, where the opponent will not continually bounce off the wall perpetually. But the bigger issues come in the actual true infinites that are in the game. For example, a pretty easy one that you can do is Rouge's dash attack. If you do this against the opponent in the corner, then they're just trapped in hit stun, and you can just repeatedly do this move, and there is nothing they can do about that, and you can just kill them immediately. And there are a couple of things like this, where if you get your opponent stuck in the corner, certain characters can just kill them with absolutely nothing they can do about it. But that is at least circumstantial and avoidable if you play well, but a far bigger problem is for a character like Amy. She can just loop her 3-hit combo into itself infinitely, and there's just nothing you can do. The timing on this is fairly tight if you want it to be a true combo, but with enough practice, you can just do this over and over and over, and there's nothing that can be done about it. And this is just the stuff I was able to find in the game. I'm sure that there are even more problems that you could find in this kind of system. And those are only the problems with things being too powerful. There are also problems with other things that are nearly useless. For example, some characters' basic 3-hit combo into their smash attack is not actually a true combo, and you can just block in the middle of their attack string. Sonic, for example, suffers from this problem. He does his 1, 2, 3, and then if you time it correctly, even if you're being hit, you can block his smash attack, meaning his basic string combo isn't actually very good. And other characters have this kind of problem as well. Gamma, in particular, has it the worst because his basic starting attack is so slow that on reaction, you can block it basically every single time, and again, the 3rd hit of his basic string is so slow that even on hit, you can block in the middle of it and interrupt him, and punish him for hitting you. There's also a couple of other things like that, where some moves in some circumstances are actually punishable on hit. So if you land an attack on your opponent, they get a free opportunity to hit you back, which is really not okay. Another thing that I think could be incredibly cheap in this game is the fact that you can attack immediately upon respawning, and there are a lot of special moves in the game where you immediately attack downward while in the air. And so imagine what this looks like of when you're on the receiving end and you just killed your opponent and they put their respawn reticle right on top of you, and then the very frame they respawn, they do their air special and come crashing down on top of you. There is no way that you could ever possibly predict when they're going to come down exactly, because they have so much time that they can use to drop on your head whenever they want. And you can't just try to repeatedly block to mitigate this, because your opponent can just wait in between your blocks and just hit you then. So there's really no way to counter the fact that respawning opponents basically just get a free surprise attack on you that there's really not much you can do about. And so I imagine that if you actually started to play Sonic Battle competitively, then what it would really turn into is really cheap-ass strats where both players are probably just going to be trying to get their opponent into situations where they can infinite them, which is not exactly great. Which is quite a shame because, as I said before, I think that the Sonic Battle systems have a lot of potential here, and I would really like to see these systems utilized in a game with maybe a more functioning combat system that doesn't have these kinds of problems. A Sonic Battle 2 would be really cool, where they could take these systems and mechanics and fix the issues here and then flesh them out even further and add more depth and options, and it could be really cool. I didn't even get into all the cool stuff that you can do on a per character basis with their different movesets, but there are definitely a lot of really interesting differences across the characters that make them play differently from each other. For example, Tails is particularly good at launching opponents into the air and juggling them with his air attack. That is a really cool thing that he can do. Meanwhile, a character like Shadow has the advantage of his spike attack is by far the fastest in the game. If he manages to jump off the wall, he is probably going to spike you before you can spike him, and so you really need to be careful if you're going to try to spike Shadow to make sure that he cannot guess which direction you're going to launch him into. And then Rouge, for example, she has a really cool jump where she can hover in the air, and using her air attack, she can stay up there indefinitely, which can also actually kind of create a problem because she can just stall out the game for free and there's basically nothing another character can do about it. But because of that, if you properly time her air attack, then she can juggle opponents indefinitely in the air, which is really cool. Against actual people, this would not be as free though, because for whatever reason, the AIs just do not move around when you launch them up into the air. They just stay still even though they can move. And so if you were actually fighting a real person with this, then you'd have to try to be predicting where they're going to move to try to escape your attacks. So you would really not want to get into a situation where Rouge has you in the air because you'd have to try to get away from her. And then, like, her aerial trap is really cool because it will stay in the air and it will track above opponents. They can't really jump or else they're going to hit your trap. Meanwhile, with Knuckles, he has my favorite single move in the entire game, where he has basically the equivalent of this game's Falcon Punch. It's just a massive wind-up punch that leads to a ton of damage that sends your opponent flying. And what's really cool about this move is you can do it while moving, and Knuckles will kind of just slide along the ground, preserving that speed. And what's especially cool about that is you can actually change direction while doing this punch, yet still keep the same direction and speed that you had before. So you can, like, walk away from your opponent and they can start chasing after you, and you can start doing the punch backwards, still going in the same direction, and hit them as they're trying to chase after you. What the fuck? Why is there so much cool shit that you can do in this game? Like, it's so cool. And there's other cool tech like this that you can do with other characters. Like, there's some serious shit in here that, again, I really think would be cool if we got, like, a Sonic Battle 2 that could flesh out these mechanics even further. Plus, in a second Sonic Battle game, you could add in extra characters. We could have the Chaotix available, and Silver, and Blaze, and whatever, and, you know, that would just be super cool to see them in this kind of combat system. I want to do cool ninja shit with Espio. Plus, in a Sonic Battle 2, we could get everyone's favorite Sonic character in there, Zavok. So, Sonic Battle, as a fighting game, I think it has potential. It probably is a fucked up, broken, imbalanced mess, but there's definitely cool stuff here, for sure. But as I said, I have never actually played Sonic Battle as a competitive fighting game. I've only ever played it single player, so I also want to talk about that as well. How does Sonic Battle work as more of a single-player game? Because things become very different when you're no longer playing against an opponent that is an actual human, because the ability to predict your opponent and the mind games and all that stuff goes away, and so now things change up quite a bit. Some of those things are still there. For example, just throwing out special moves is still a bit risky because you don't know what your opponents have selected as their immunities, but the ability to try to predict them and notice patterns in their behaviors and stuff like that kind of goes out the window. And the AI in this game is pretty simple and pretty dumb and pretty predictable. For example, if you kill your opponent with a one-shot special move, then there is pretty much a 100% chance that they're going to select that special move as their immunity. So they end up becoming very predictable in that sense. But actually, I think that's probably a good thing in the context of playing against AI, because it's not really possible to read what they're going to do. And so them becoming predictable actually ends up kind of being to the game's benefit, because it gives you more opportunity to strategize correctly, as if this is more of a single-player action game or a beat-em-up or something like that. The game also does become quite a bit easier and more forgiving when you're playing against the AI, because they will not always capitalize on situations that they find themselves in. If they block, they sometimes won't retaliate against you, and so they'll just let you get away with being blocked for free, even though they could have hit you and there would have been nothing you could have done about it. And so things do become a lot less risky. You know, if you want to know what special moves your opponent is immune to, you can kind of just throw out special moves to them, and most of the time you're probably going to get away with it scot-free. And of course, the AI is not really capable of strategizing in the way where they might withhold using special moves so you don't know what they have. they're just gonna do whatever they do. This can make getting launched around extremely difficult to deal with against the AI because there's no way to predict which direction they're going to launch you in because it's essentially random. And this can particularly become a problem when you're fighting against multiple AIs, as they can gang up on you and stun lock you into pretty much unwinnable situations where you just die instantly with no ability to do anything. Which is another thing you could probably argue is a problem if playing Sonic Battle competitively, is like in 2v2 modes, you could absolutely wombo combo your opponents into infinite stun lock combos extremely easily by passing them back and forth between you and your teammate. And you can see that happen sometimes when you're playing against a bunch of AIs, because they will explicitly always go out of their way to target you. Even if it's a free-for-all fight, you can see all of the AIs always gravitate toward you, and they definitely prioritize the player way more than each other. Which, in the context of this being a single-player game, I'm fine with them primarily targeting me. It's just that due to the nature of this game's problems with its mechanics, it can mean that you can just get killed instantly with nothing you can do about it because you're just being ganged up on. I mean, if you attack the opponent, there's really no way to bait them into blocking because they're AIs. They can just read your inputs and respond accordingly, so if they want to block every single attack you do, they're just gonna do it, and there's nothing you can do about it. And when fighting multiple AIs, this especially becomes a problem because you try to do an attack and one of them blocks you, and then at the same time, another one starts hitting you, and you just get fucked. Also, another problem? Nothing really stops you from just spamming your special moves like crazy. If you know that your opponent is not immune to your special move, then you can just use it over and over and over, and if it's a particularly good and powerful special move, that can be extremely effective. Now, this might not be super good against other people because then you become very predictable, but against AI, you can just keep on throwing out the same thing over and over, and they just get fucked. And there are a number of things in the game that start to work in the player's favor when you're fighting against AI that can actually make the game a bit more fun as well. For example, as I said before, for whatever reason, the AI just refuse to move around when they get launched up into the air, which allows you to create a bunch of cool juggle combos that would not work against an actual person, but do against AI. So you can just have a bunch of fun being creative with combo stuff, and that can be cool in its own way. One move that I neglected to mention before, because I don't think it would really be useful when fighting other people because you can move when you get launched into the air, is you have a dedicated launcher move to shoot your opponent upward, but they're not in hit stun during this, so opponents can just get out of the way. But since AIs just stand there, you can just launch them up into the air, and then they'll fall right back down into whatever you want to hit them with. And so you can have a lot of fun just experimenting on the AIs and seeing what you can do with this combat system, just throwing them around, hitting them into stuff, using special moves to combo off of spikes and stuff like that. This is a way to really take advantage of the cool things you can do in Sonic Battle's combat system in a way that doesn't really have many problems because it's not in a competitive context. You're not really as much playing the game in order to win and beat the opponents. It's now kind of just like a playground of using these combat mechanics to do cool shit, which I definitely think becomes necessary when you're fighting AI, because generally they're pretty freaking easy to beat, even the most difficult of AIs. So really, that's the only way you're going to have any fun playing the single player in this game, if you ask me. Additionally, certain things that are problems when you're playing the game competitively actually turn into cool things that you can do when playing single player. You know, doing infinites on the opponents that require tight timing actually becomes like a fun input challenge that you can try to hone your skills at and get better at. Doing fucked up combos where your opponent just has nothing they can do can be really fun. It just really fucks up with a competitive game. But if you're just fighting AIs, then hey, go ahead, wail on them for free, and nothing is harmed in that sense. This also makes it so when the AI is attacking you and they have those ineffective attack strings that you can just block in the middle of, that actually kind of works as a cool way to break out of the enemy's attacks from a single-player action game perspective. One example of this that I really like is Gamma has a unique trait where after he dies, he does like a suicide explosion that can get hits on the opponents after he's already been killed. Competitively, this is actually really, really bad in a lot of circumstances because the timing of this is so consistent and generous enough that you can very easily block this almost every single time and just get free meter for killing your opponent. This makes Gamma a very bad character to play competitively, but when you're in a single-player context, then it becomes a little challenge. Every time you kill Gamma, you have the opportunity to get some free meter, and that actually works. Though another extremely effective thing you can do against the AI is certain characters with their recovery can fill their super meter extremely quickly, and so you can kind of just repeatedly spam super moves at your opponent, and that will basically just kill them instantly over and over and over. And like I said, they will pretty much always switch their immunity to whatever one-shot killed them last time, so you can just switch between your ground special and your air special, and just kill your opponent in one hit repeatedly, and just get a free win. So as a single-player game, I definitely think that Sonic Battle has some problems, but some of the problems that exist when playing competitively kind of go away. However, new ones start to appear, but I do still think that you can have a lot of fun just experimenting with this combat system and fucking around, basically. As far as modes go when you're playing in single player, then naturally you can just do fights against the AI if you want, but of course there's also an arcade mode that you can go through. That's what most of the footage you've been watching so far has been, is me playing arcade mode with all the different characters. But then there is also the story mode, which I'm not going to talk about the story of Sonic Battle in this video, that'll get its own video. But as far as playing the story mode, to be honest, it's not particularly great. It can be pretty fun at first if this is how you first start playing the game, because it gives you kind of a tour of all the different characters and gives you plenty of opportunities to experiment with their movesets with all the story fights that you end up doing. But the problem is that the story mode kind of ends up dragging along quite a bit, as it has you doing the same fights over and over quite often, and a lot of these fights are way longer than they need to be. For example, you'll have a fight against a character and it'll be first to 5 KOs, and like, okay, that's fine. But then immediately upon winning the fight, then the character will go, "I'm not done yet," and you will immediately just go back into the exact same fight, but now it'll be first to 10 KOs, and it's just like doing the exact same thing, but for even longer, and 10 KOs is quite a bit. That takes a while to get in Sonic Battle, depending on how many opponents you're fighting. And so doing 2 fights back-to-back, getting a total of 15 KOs on the exact same opponents, it kind of just gets pretty tiresome and boring. And fights like this crop up a lot when you're playing through the story mode. But that is not the only problem that the story mode has. The other problem the story mode has is in relation to Emerald, who is a feature of the game that I have yet to talk about. And on paper, I think Emerald is really cool. What Emerald is it is a character that can adopt the moves of other characters. You can actually go into a whole menu and customize Emerald's moveset to give him any ability from any other character on a per-move basis, which I think is pretty cool in and of itself, but the problem is that when you're playing through the story mode, Emerald has to level up and unlock abilities in order to be able to equip them, which is the real problem, because it mainly introduces a shit ton of grinding to playing through the story mode. Because at the beginning of the story, Emerald is insanely weak and basically cannot do anything. And the problem with that is that at certain points throughout the story mode, the game will force you to play Emerald and win a fight in order to continue on. And the way leveling up Emerald works is every time you complete a fight in story mode, then you get some skill points. And skill points are the thing that allow you to equip different moves. Every move has a certain number of skill points that it costs to equip. Increasing the number of skill points you have increases how many moves you can equip. So that means in order to get an Emerald that can actually equip some decent moves and become a relatively competent fighter, you're just gonna have to do a bunch of fights in order to grind up to get enough skill points to actually make Emerald something that can be usable. And that problem is compounded with how you unlock moves as Emerald, because when you finish a story mode fight, you randomly unlock one move per every character that was in that fight. And randomly is the real issue there, because you might not get moves that you desperately need, say your basic attack string, and so you're gonna randomly get whatever the game throws at you, and it might be stuff that you already have better moves for, it might be moves that you've already gotten in previous fights, and so on and so forth. And so again, this basically just turns into a bunch of grinding to get random drops to eventually get moves that you can actually use. And so in effect, what this turns into is at certain points you get into roadblocks in the story mode where they force you to play as Emerald and do a fight that you are just not equipped to win. And so you have to just go back to different fights in the story mode and play them over and over and over, slowly building up your skill points and slowly randomly getting moves that might actually be usable until eventually you have an emerald that you can actually fight with. In theory, I don't hate this system, but the way that it works and the amount of time it takes to grind up an emerald that's actually usable is not okay. It takes fucking forever to get to a point where you can actually fight effectively with Emerald. And this can turn the story mode from a little bit boring because of all of the repeated fights that you have to do that drag on for too long, into a serious slog where you have to do so much grinding just doing the same fights over and over and over and over. So much so that my recommendation for playing Sonic Battle is to download a save file online that already has everything unlocked for him, so that way you can just play through the story mode and customize Emerald to whatever you want him to be. Personally, I like to just set him as a carbon copy of whatever character story I'm currently playing through, so that way I have more time to experiment with that moveset and try to figure things out. But of course, I also have my own custom Emerald moveset that I put together out of all of the best moves that I think would work really well and fit my playstyle. And this, I think, is the real reason Emerald was implemented into the game and I think would be really cool. Because obviously, competitively, Emerald would probably have to be banned because you could just make him whatever the fuck you want and he could have all the most broken OP bullshit that every other character would have. But the way Emerald works is actually kind of trying to incorporate some, like, collectible trading card game elements into the gameplay where you play through and you level up your Emerald almost like you're raising a Pokemon, and then you get random moves, and from those random moves you piece them all together to create your Emerald, and then I assume the idea is that you're supposed to take your Emerald and fight that against other players and their Emeralds to see who can make a better Emerald and, you know, all that kind of thing, building up your own fighter out of your own practice and hard work and time investment. It's a cool idea, but at the cost of so much shitty fucking grinding that does hurt just playing through the story mode. And personally, I'm just not really a fan of this sort of random loot box style collectible trading card game type of gameplay. I much prefer when a game just lets you have all the options and you can just do whatever you want from the get-go, which is another reason why I recommend just downloading a save file that has everything, because now I don't need to spend dozens and dozens of hours just getting the moves I need to make the Emerald I want. I can just make him, and if I do say so myself, my Emerald is pretty nasty. Bring it on, fuckers. I bet my Emerald could beat yours. And I bet he has a cooler color palette too, because that's another thing you can customize on Emerald. So yeah, that's the story mode of Sonic Battle. Kinda cool, but extremely problematic if you play it as intended. But if you download a save file, then it still has some pacing issues and kind of drags on, but it's a good way to experiment with the characters and learn their movesets and stuff. And the story is actually kind of good, so you might actually just want to play through the story mode for that, but we'll talk about that another time. And with that, we have finished talking about Sonic Battle. A very, very cool and very interesting game that I think has a lot of potential. The game itself definitely has some problems and could probably be very fucked up if you actually tried to play this seriously as a fighting game. But I think there is a lot of cool stuff here that could be fixed up and fleshed out, and I would love to see that. If not a Sonic Battle 2, then could some indie developer out there please make a spiritual successor to Sonic Battle that takes these mechanics and does even more with them? I think that would be really cool.